Well, fantastic. Thanks for having me back. This is my second CMX event. I was on stage in person in Redwood City in 2019, so I missed that, but I'm so happy that we have the technology to support us doing this in this virtual space. So thank you for having me again. I am so excited. It took us a little while to come up with this title. We kind of geeked out, my team and I, as we were coming up with this title. And our heads all went into space and the infinity and the infiniteness of communities. So super excited to share with you my wide variety of experiences across the many developer communities I've had the fortunate experience of working with. So a little bit about me, as I've mentioned a little bit earlier, I am Grace from Cisco. I am actually authentically from San Francisco. And today I get to say that I'm also from Cisco, a global company that is often well known as a network company, but we're actually a global software company as well, which I'm very proud to talk about. I have a long history in developer relations, and actually even before my career in developer relations, I was a developer myself way back when, and that started way back at IBM in a subsidiary called Lotus. I was a developer for their desktop database called Lotus Approach. And then I started my career later on at Microsoft as a developer. We used to call them evangelists. So I was a developer evangelist at Microsoft for 8 years and a wide variety of different initiatives and projects that I'll talk a little bit about. And I took that craft of that early developer relations experience and I continued to hone and develop that as I took that to places like Intuit and Yodlee, both fintech and SMB kinds of companies. And then I was very lucky to end up in 3 back-to-back unicorn companies. By sheer accident, I didn't actually plan on being in 3 back-to-back unicorn companies. I'm very fortunate. And I was able to continue to hone that craft in these 3 other companies that I've led developer relations in. And today I'm at Cisco and taking on a wide variety of new initiatives and challenges at Cisco, working with both network engineers and infrastructure engineers, shepherding them to a programmable world, as well as helping Cisco build bridges to developers who are building for a cloud-first world. So thanks for joining me today. So first and foremost, wow, I have been unusually lucky in the wide variety of experiences, whether it was enterprise or small business or fintech, gaming. I never thought I would end up in a gaming company. That was never in my plan. And so I did have sort of a meandering path and took often not a very well-worn path. And in general, I'm sure many of you appreciate this as community leaders, that there hasn't been a well-worn path when it comes to community in general. When I was learning the craft of developer relations and community, there was no book, there was no CMX. This event's wonderful. It's a great way for us to share learnings and best practices. So I did things the hard way. I learned along the way and had a lot of lessons as well. So I'm going to share some of that with you. And most importantly, one of the things that I learned that others are still learning is this idea of community being the secret sauce. Now, I know you all know that community is the secret sauce, but the reality is many of our colleagues in the businesses that we work for haven't quite gotten there yet. And so it's really on us as the community leaders to own that ongoing education and nurturing and fostering this concept of the fact that community is really, that's the secret sauce that really propels the success of many companies, some of which I'll talk about here in a few minutes. So no matter what size of company you're in, small startup or large enterprise, community as the secret sauce needs to be something that we communicate on a regular basis. I know there's been a lot of discussions the last couple of days on metrics and defining data, and those are all very important things to be able to bring forth to the table to discuss the importance of community. But there are all sorts of other things that we need to also keep an eye out on when it comes to the practice of community. Some places, community I found has treated as solely as a support vehicle. And I'd say, it isn't just about support. You're missing so much when you think about community as just a support vehicle. Community, it's really about the relationships you build and building those bridges. Community needs to be something that we really think about as something to invest in as early as possible. And 2 great examples of companies I've had the fortunate opportunity to work for, Atlassian and Roblox. In the very early days, those founders of those companies really invested and leaned into the practice of nurturing and activating the community, because they recognized that was really an important part of the success of the company. And I'm sure many of you who are aware of Atlassian or aware of Roblox, they really skyrocket into success. A huge component of that is really the halo effect, that network effect that they have with community people authentically going and advocating about the products and their successes in the ecosystem. And so that's an important thing to really consider and think about. Now, we're all in the business of building relationships, right? That's the core and heart of what we do as community leaders. And these 4 concepts, these are obvious things to us, right? These are really important pillars of building community that we need to ensure are there on a regular basis. This is a human endeavor, and we need to consider that as part of all of the work that we do. And whether it's in person or virtual, you really need to make sure these elements are there on an ongoing, regular, and sustainable basis. First and foremost, you got to listen to your community. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, and about the fact that while it's obvious, it's not always practiced. Building respect, we'll talk about that in a bit as well. Respect is a huge component of a healthy and active community. Being clear, concise, transparent in your communication may seem obvious, but something, again, you have to be really intentional about. And then 4th, things that we're always doing, engaging and activating that community, being really present, and really help foster and nurture your community along their adoption path. So, listening. We all do this, right? We all listen. That's an obvious thing to be able to do. But the thing is, there are a couple of traps that people fall into when we think about the fact that you need to support and listen to your community. You have to ask yourself, are you actively listening to your community? I'll give you a great example. We've got great developer advocates. I've had great developer advocates from company to company and company. And we get really excited and we get to an event and we love to talk about technology and we get super energetic about that. But sometimes that can get ahead of us, and we have to really actively think about also listening. And that means that when we're on stage and we're speaking, we're doing our presentation, we actually have to carve off time to make sure after the event, really sitting and speaking with the event attendees and really listening to what they have to say, the questions they have, the feedback that they have. That's what I mean about the active listening. Sometimes we don't make that time and we parachute in, parachute out, but that is one of the most important things that we can be doing, is ensuring that we're doing active listening. Second is, are you doing this on a regular basis? Do you have a good heartbeat on what's going on in your community? So, having that rhythm, understanding what's happening with your community is super important. So, have you started with a benchmark? Do you know what the health of your community is? Do you have an NPS or CSAT score that you can say, here's where we're starting, here's the health of our community today, and here's how I want to continue to improve it and make sure that it gets better and better and better over time. So, it's great to have ad hoc feedback, and make sure to keep your ear to the ground and really listen to that qualitative feedback that you're getting from the community, really synthesizing that content so that you can bring that back internally to your product teams, your leadership, so that you can express the trends that are happening in your community. But just as importantly, you have to also have a regular framework and understanding and having that real pulse on what's happening in your community regularly, with just something as simple as an NPS score. How well are we doing? Would you advocate having a friend come and join our community? Now, understanding, it really drives a sense of belonging. What do I mean by this? It's super important for us. We get really involved in thinking about our products and our technologies and driving adoption around that. That is super important. But the community itself is a group of people. And you want to nurture and foster a sense of belonging in that community. And sometimes that's as simple as making sure there's a lounge area in your forum or in your chat room, so that people can talk about common topics that they would be talking about if, let's say, we were all in a conference and we were on a coffee break and we're not talking about the tech anymore, we're just talking as people, right? And we want to feel like there's a sense of community, of friends and family and networking, where the sharing of communication and knowledge and best practices is amongst friends. So fostering and nurturing that is super important. And a great example of that, I was very fortunate to work at Roblox, where my audience there was a very, very young audience of developers, some of whom were starting in their pre-teens, honestly, and some of our very experienced developers were only in their late teens to early 20s, but a really delightful community to work with. I learned a lot from them, and that they really did make very specific spaces in the forums to talk about their creations, to share and celebrate new art that they had done, new music they had done. So it wasn't just about the code even, because Roblox was really a vast community of creators and developers. And so sharing the art and celebrating the work was a big component of that community. And it really fostered a sense of not just belonging, but helpfulness. The community was actively helping out along the way, whether it was code and best practices, or helping to ensure that someone knew a great artist to use for their game. So these are the things that can come out of fostering, nurturing that sense of strong belonging to a community. Now, respect. Respect is something that we all want to foster and nurture in our communities bi-directionally. And that always has to start with, setting that tone from your group, your community group, as well as your entire company. Because as you go out and speak to your community, you all represent that tone and style of how you want to interact and engage with the community. It always needs to be done in a respectful way. If you don't have a code of conduct already, please consider that. It's a super important way of setting expectations about what you do expect in terms of behaviors, both in your online virtual experiences, whether they're chat rooms or forums or in virtual events like this, and as well as we get back to semi-normal, at least, in real life events, setting same practice and making sure that everyone that goes to that event understands what's expected in terms of behavior. Respectfulness, obviously, is always at the core of all of that. Now, I will say that, too, as a community leader, you do need to consider being a coach and mentor in some cases, both for your internal community, so your employees who are representing your company as part of the community, as well as your external community members. Because sometimes people don't really understand that subtle things that they do may be rubbing someone the wrong way. And that coaching and mentoring can be really helpful to ensure that you're not having fires in your community because some dialogue has gone off the rails. In some cases, and we did practices at Roblox, we did have this practice of timeout from time to time with some of our younger members who were not quite participating in a very friendly way. And because of that strong sense of belonging that we were just talking about, the loss of access to the community was something really meaningful to them. They really were forced to reflect on that behavior. And then, of course, we would allow them back in. And forgiveness is a big thing, particularly in such a young community like this, where people are still evolving and growing. But I'd say that one of the things that I learned from that practice is that those things that we did for such a young community has a lot of validity, even for older, mature, professional audiences as well. All of us as adults, I'm sure, can share experiences of, conversations that have gone off the rails where, perhaps putting in a little bit of a practice of coaching, mentoring that member, or even perhaps having an adult timeout is appropriate. So these are things to consider. And, I will say that sense of belonging really was such a valuable component to many of our members at Roblox that we really didn't have to do a whole lot of timeouts, which is a great thing. Now, if you are investing in your career as a community leader, I will tell you this right now, if you haven't been doing this very long, it's super important to be prepared to have tough questions and to face those head on. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. But first and foremost, I will say I love that we had a Headspace speaker yesterday. I caught part of her talk. I'm a big fan of Headspace. At Cisco, we have access to Calm as well. And the practice of mindfulness, of being present in the moment, is super helpful when you're having crucial conversations. Another great book to buy as well, perhaps, which is, there's a lot of training around crucial conversations in that book called Crucial Conversations. And, there are going to be sticky situations where instinctively, you're going to want to run the other direction. But as a community leader, it's so important to have those active conversations. While I was at Microsoft, in my last couple of years at Microsoft, I had this set of work which was about outreach to really popular web open source frameworks. And at that time, Microsoft was not the most welcome member in these open source communities. I was often presented with a situation in these conferences, in-person conferences, where I was walking around and someone would stop by and then suddenly turn and say, "Hey, aren't you that Microsoft person? What the bleep are you doing here?" And, I could have just walked away, but as the one and only Microsoft representative, I knew that wasn't the right thing to do. My job was to build bridges. And so I had to stand my ground and really talk about, hey, I'm here because we have joint customers, and I really want to find that the right solutions to have interoperability to make these solutions work really great together. And in that, they might kind of gruff and go away after a while. But the proof is always in the pudding and actually completing that commitment. And so it did take a couple of years of showing, hey, I've invested in these integrations. I've made sure there's support. I've made sure there's documentation. We've made sure that we're landing it in the right places so that you have easy access to it. So, really fulfilling the commitment after addressing that tough question is also very important. But just one example, but facing tough questions is a super important skill to have as a community leader, no matter how difficult of a situation or small of a situation you may be encountering. Now, communication. We do this every day, but we always need to be really, really super intentional about our communication as community leaders. And particularly if you're in a situation where you are actually working to build bridges across multiple communities, it's extremely important to understand the terminology, the dialogue, the language that's actually effectively used day to day, whether it's popular memes or certain slang that the group is using to really effectively communicate their pain points, their challenges, the way that they celebrate. A super important part of that culture and being accepted into that as a member or contributor is to really adopt what's already there. So one example of that was when again, back to my Microsoft days and doing open sources, subtle things like the WordPress community talked about their extensions and the language they use is all about plugins. And you get your plugins off of the WordPress.org site. Similarly, Drupal had a similar concept, but they called them modules. So you wouldn't go to a Drupal person and ask about a plugin. And similarly, you wouldn't go to a WordPress person and talk about modules because that would inherently already light up a fire of, hey, you're in the wrong community. So understanding the language that's used is super important, especially if there are different communities. I would say, though, that even in the same community, as in the case of Roblox, understanding that the dialogue there when we're talking about people who tend to be more artists, who don't really aspire to be coders or creators. And then we also had a whole community of developers who loved coding, who loved being viewed as developers. And so acknowledging these two sets of communities within a broader community for the platform was super important to be inclusive of all that and to make sure that everyone was welcome and had a place for that dialogue and feedback. Now, we're going to talk about engagement. And it's super important that we think about right sizing and using the right tools at the right times. And I love this photo. The only thing that I would change about this photo is perhaps putting 3 or 4 more big goldfish in that little bowl to sort of express some of the things that I've seen. So let's start first with chatting about chat. So whether it's Slack or WebEx chat, these are really awesome tools to use as you're building up a net new community and building relationships that require a lot more high touch, especially in those early stages of adoption. If it's a new product or you're driving a net new, very important launch and new big, large feature sets, you want to have a small subset of adopters that you have what I call like white glove sort of interactions with, where you're really having close ties to them on a day-to-day basis. chat is an awesome, awesome vehicle. Similarly, as your community grows and you're building out a champions or ambassador program, this is the right place for you to actively nurture that relationship on a day-to-day basis, because you want to have that closeness, that proximity with people that are really investing a lot in your company and your product. Now, if you're doing really well as a company and your growth of the community gets into the thousands, this may not be the right way to continue that relationship at scale. I would still advocate for you to keep it for that early adopter program and for your champions, but there are other considerations when you think about you scaling up the community. And there, many people that know me will know that I advocate for use of forums. And the reason why is that there is a tendency to ask the same questions over and over again. So, the nice thing about forums is you can pin an FAQ so that people can easily see the commonly asked questions really quickly in FAQ. The other side of this is you get the benefit of SEO. So when someone is Googling a question, they immediately get to your forum post about that. You don't get that when you're in Slack or WebEx chat, because it's a temporary thread, and at some point it might actually get cleaned up and go away. It's also really just difficult to find when something's asked over and over and over again. So really encourage you, remember to think about what are the right tools at the right times at the right sizes of your community. The flip side of this is if you're starting your community really early on and you only have 10 to 100 people, the forum may not be the right place for you to start off with, because it might look a little too empty, maybe not so inviting, maybe a little too intimidating. So use the right tools at the right times. Here, lessons learned from me a few times over. When you are a new leader for an existing community, or you're doing outreach to a net new community that's already been built up, always really important to think about going where they are, because they may not be going to your properties or your events. So thinking through what is the target audience you're really trying to invite or to engage with as part of your community activities. And they may be on Stack Overflow or Reddit or Hacker News. Thinking through that is super important. Excuse me. So again, on open source, one of the things we talked about plugins and modules. There was a group that I was working with at Microsoft, and they developed this plugin for, I think it was of course WordPress, and it was put on a microsite for downloads. And they came to me and said, "Hey, well, why am I not getting a whole lot of downloads here?" And I said, "Well, it's a great plugin, but you've got it in the wrong place. You got to go where they are. Plugins, all WordPress developers are going to WordPress.org to find plugins that they want to use. So you got to land it over there and follow their rules." So, really basic things, but sometimes you don't really get the nuances of these details unless you're spending time really learning and listening to how the community is really engaging. So, as we all know, community, it's a human relationship. It is really the most important aspect of the work that we do. And a lot of the things that we talked about seem like really obvious, but if you're missing any components of those 4 pieces, they can really fall down, right? So be really intentional, be really regular and consistent about it. Other things that I've seen in communities that I've picked up over time is that communities sometimes are, spun up, spun down. It's like, different programs, but then the lack of consistency in nurturing, activating, and managing it isn't there. And so, there you lose some opportunity for that scale, that momentum, the word of mouth that companies like Atlassian and Roblox really benefit from is because of that consistency of engagement, that consistency of nurturing. So think about that as you're investing in your community. And while we're striving for meaningful metrics to present to our leadership and those who are involved in deciding where funding goes, let's not lose sight over the fact that the most important part is that capital R in relations in the work that we do, and fostering that and nurturing that in a sustainable way.
Grace, this is absolutely fantastic. I don't know if this was the last slide, but we've just about run out of time. I just wanted to tell you about it. That's why I've come up.
Two more minutes. I'm almost done, I swear. Empathy is your absolute superpower. So if you do all the things, you listen, you learn, you engage in those tough conversations, empathy is your absolute superpower in all of this work. So I encourage you to think about this as your superpower. This is what will help you in your conversations with your execs and with your other stakeholders, as well as your community. Be empathetic, really listen, learn, and engage. Because at the end of the day, it is all about people, right? And this is why we're all here. That was it, Iker. Thank you.
Fantastic. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt the last message. It's we had some really cool questions, but is there a way for our listeners to connect with you on social media or similar, maybe to continue that conversation, or maybe through a network table?
Yes, absolutely. That can be done. I'm Grace Afar on Twitter. I don't do a whole lot of Twitter, but people can find me on LinkedIn as well if they want to send me a message.
Fantastic. I wish that we had all the time in the world to listen to you, and of course, to listen to all your all your experiences at with the developer communities. So it's been a pleasure and privilege for us to listen to you and to hear what you've shared. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking the time to participate to CMX Summit Rise, and how great it was to meet you and to listen to you share what you have at Cisco in terms of experience with developer communities. Fantastic. So this session has ended, ladies and gents. So basically, we're just going to be moving to the next one. That's going to start within a minute. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to Grace. Grace, thanks again once more.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. And we hope to see you in the next one. Please use CMX Summit Rise as the hashtag. And all the very best to everyone, and see you in the next sessions.